Welcome to Café Tales. I'm Alie, your host for today. We're joining Father Brown today in water in Brussels with the bones of the bishop. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. Pour yourself a comforting beverage, keep an open mind, and let's delve into this mystery together. The Bones of the Bishop, Chapter 1. The Cathedral of Shadows. The Cathedral of St. Whodunit had always been a building that seemed to argue with itself. Its soaring Gothic arches spoke of aspiration toward heaven, while its massive stone foundation suggested a determination to remain firmly planted on earth. In the autumn of 1915, however, the ancient structure appeared to have lost the argument entirely. German artillery had taken several bites from its western tower, leaving jagged stone teeth against the grey Brussels sky. And what had once been a monument to eternal certainties now bore witness to the very temporal business of war. Father Brown stood in the cathedral's shadow, his round figure dwarfed by the damaged magnificence above him. His black umbrella, sturdy as a walking stick, tapped thoughtfully against the cobblestones as his mild brown eyes surveyed the scene. Even in ruin, or perhaps especially in ruin, the building possessed a peculiar majesty, like an old king who has lost his crown but retained his dignity. Padre called the crisp voice in accented English. "You are the English priest, yes?" Father Brown turned to see a tall figure in German grey approaching with measured steps. The officer's uniform was impeccable despite the morning's dampness, and his bearing suggested the sort of military precision that extended to his thoughts as well as his deportment. Yet there was something in his pale blue eyes that spoke of interests beyond the purely martial. "I am Father Brown," he replied mildly, offering a slight bow, "though I confess I am here more as a shepherd seeking his scattered flock than as any sort of diplomatic envoy." "Colonel Heinrich Zimmermann," the German said, clicking his heels with a gesture that managed to be both formal and somehow apologetic. "I have been expecting you. Your bishop's letter mentioned your pastoral concerns for the English Catholics remaining in Brussels." The priest nodded, though his eyes were already wandering back to the cathedral's wounded facade. "Buildings seem to suffer in wartime much as people do," he observed quietly, "though I sometimes wonder if stones remember their wounds longer than flesh does." Colonel Zimmermann followed his gaze with what appeared to be genuine interest. "You speak as one who appreciates architecture, Father. This particular cathedral has fascinated me since our arrival. 13th century, primarily, though with some earlier Romanesque elements incorporated into the crypt structure. The stonework is remarkably preserved, considering that men have been trying to knock it down for 700 years, Father Brown suggested with gentle humor. A smile flickered across the colonel's austere features. "Precisely, though I suspect the current damage may prove more easily repaired than some of the spiritual wounds this building has witnessed." Before Father Brown could inquire into this cryptic observation, the cathedral's great doors creaked open, and two figures emerged into the pale morning light. The first was clearly a clergyman, elderly man, whose white hair framed a face that seemed carved from the same weathered stone as the building behind him. His cassock, though carefully mended, spoke of years of faithful service, and his hands trembled slightly as they clutched a worn breviary. "Ah, Per Matthias," Colonel Zimmermann said. "Please meet Father Brown, the English priest I mentioned." The old sacristan's eyes pale blue and watery with age fixed upon Father Brown with an intensity that was almost disconcerting. "English," he murmured in heavily accented English, and then switched to French. "Forgive me, mon père, but these days I find myself suspicious of strangers." "Per Matthias has served St. Whodunit for nearly 40 years, Colonel Zimmermann explained, though his tone suggested a certain patient exasperation with the old man's mystical tendencies. "His knowledge of the building's history is ... comprehensive." The second figure to emerge was a boy of perhaps 12 years, though malnutrition had likely made him appear younger than his actual age. His dark hair was cropped close, and his clothes, while clean, were clearly the cast-offs of larger children. Yet his eyes held an alertness that spoke of intelligence sharpened by necessity. "This is Emile," Per Matthias said, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "He assists me with the altar duties and knows every stone of this place as well as I do." The boy ducked his head shyly, but peered up at Father Brown with curious eyes. "Bonjour mon père," he said softly. "Bonjour Emile," Father Brown replied warmly. "I imagine you have many interesting stories about this cathedral." Something flickered in the boy's expression, a quick, almost furtive glance toward the cathedral's darkened interior. But before Father Brown could pursue the observation, Colonel Zimmerman was speaking again. "We have been conducting some necessary repairs to the structure," he said, his scholarly enthusiasm evident. "The recent shelling damaged more than just the exterior. Some of the interior stonework has shifted, particularly around the chancel area. We discovered that the bishop's throne has been compromised. The foundation stones beneath it have settled considerably." Per Matthias crossed himself quickly. "It is not wise to disturb the resting places of the holy," he muttered. "Superstition, old friend," the colonel said, though not unkindly. "Though I admit the work has revealed some unexpected architectural features. Perhaps, Father Brown, you would join us for an inspection. Your ecclesiastical perspective might prove valuable." Father Brown nodded, though he found himself studying the three faces before him with growing interest. Each seemed to hold secrets as surely as the damaged cathedral held shadows. The German officer's scholarly passion appeared genuine, yet there was something almost fevered in his interest in the building's hidden spaces. The old sacristan's devotion was unquestionable, but his mystical utterances suggested a mind that might see visions where others saw only stone and mortar. And the boy there was something in young Emil's quick, watchful glances that spoke of knowledge carefully guarded as they moved toward the cathedral's great doors. Father Brown reflected that buildings, like people, often revealed their most interesting secrets only when they had been somehow wounded. The damaged cathedral of St. Lutgardus seemed to promise revelations of its own, though whether those revelations would prove comfortable or disturbing remained to be seen. The massive oak doors closed behind them with a sound like thunder, muffled by centuries of prayer, and Father Brown found himself standing in a vast space where daylight struggled against shadows that seemed older than the stones themselves. Chapter 2. Disturbed ground. The interior of St. Lutgardus Cathedral possessed that peculiar quality common to all great churches. It seemed larger inside than outside, as if the architects had somehow convinced space itself to bend to the requirements of worship. Father Brown followed his companions down the nave, his footsteps echoing softly against stone floors worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims. The damaged roof allowed irregular shafts of autumn light to pierce the gloom, creating patterns that shifted like thoughts half-formed in a dreaming mind. "The damage extends beyond what we initially assessed," Colonel Zimmerman explained as they walked, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man accustomed to delivering unpleasant reports. "When the shells struck the western tower, the vibrations traveled through the entire structure. We discovered significant settling in the chancel area." Father Brown nodded, though his attention had been captured by the sight of candles burning steadily before a side altar dedicated to St. Lutgardus herself. In wartime, when so many certainties had been shattered, the persistence of such simple acts of faith struck him as both touching and profound. "Here is where we discovered the problem," Per Matthias said, his voice dropping to a whisper as they approached the ornate bishop's throne that dominated the chancel. The medieval chair, carved from dark oak and adorned with symbols of episcopal authority, sat slightly askew, as if the earth beneath it had shifted in sleep. Young Emil hung back near the altar rail, his dark eyes fixed on the throne with an expression Father Brown could not quite decipher. There was something between fascination and fear in the boy's gaze, as if he were watching a place where angels and demons might equally choose to manifest. "The settling was quite dramatic," Colonel Zimmerman continued, producing a small electric torch from his uniform pocket. 3 days ago, the throne tilted nearly 15 degrees. When we investigated, he paused, clicking on the torch and directing its beam toward the base of the chair. "Perhaps it would be better to show you directly." The light revealed that several of the ancient stone slabs forming the floor had been carefully removed, exposing a rectangular opening perhaps 4 feet in length and 2 feet wide. Father Brown peered into the cavity and immediately understood why his companions had spoken with such careful restraint. What lay below was not merely a void created by settling stones, but clearly a deliberate cryptone that had been sealed for centuries and only recently opened. "A burial chamber," Father Brown observed mildly. "Though I suspect that is not the most remarkable aspect of your discovery." "Indeed not," Colonel Zimmerman said, his scholarly excitement evident despite his attempt at military composure. "The chamber appears to date from the cathedral's earliest period, possibly 11th century, based on the stonework, but the contents." He directed his torch beam more precisely into the opening. "Father Brown found himself looking down at an arrangement that was both ancient and disturbingly recent. Medieval bones, yellowed with age, lay arranged in careful ritual order, complete. Skeleton positioned with arms crossed over the chest, in the traditional posture of Christian burial. The bones were clearly very old, and the stone sarcophagus that contained them bore Latin inscriptions too worn to read clearly. But lying directly atop the ancient ribcage, impossible to ignore, was a modern photograph in a simple wooden frame. "Mon Dieu," Père Matthias whispered, crossing himself repeatedly. "It is as I feared. The spirits of the dead are walking again." Father Brown leaned closer, studying the photograph with characteristic attention to detail. It showed a young woman, in the distinctive white cap and blue cape of a Red Cross nurse. Her face was earnest and kind, with intelligent eyes that seemed to look directly at the viewer with quiet determination. "Sister Marie-Claire Dubois," Colonel Zimmerman said quietly. "She disappeared 3 weeks ago. We have been searching for her." The way he pronounced the word searching suggested complexities that went beyond simple concern for a missing person. Father Brown glanced up at him with mild curiosity. "A Red Cross nurse," he observed. "I imagine her work brought her into contact with many wounded soldiers." "Indeed," the colonel replied, though his tone had grown more cautious. "Sister Marie-Claire was known for her dedication to her patients, perhaps overly dedicated, some might say." Père Matthias clutched his breviary more tightly. "She came here often to pray," he said, "a good woman, but troubled by the sufferings she witnessed." She spoke of visions of voices calling her to serve. Young Emil shifted nervously at these words, and Father Brown noticed the boy's hands were clenched into small fists. There was something the child knew, something that frightened him into silence. The photograph was placed there deliberately, Father Brown said, though he phrased it as an observation rather than a question. "The glass is unbroken. The frame shows no damage from falling. Someone arranged this scene with considerable care." "Precisely my assessment," Colonel Zimmerman agreed, "but the question remains, who would do such a thing, and why? The crypt has been sealed for centuries. Only someone with intimate knowledge of the cathedral's structure could have known of its existence." Père Matthias's weathered hands trembled as he pointed toward the ancient bones. "These are holy relics," he said. "The bones of Bishop Arnulf, who built the first church on this site in 1087. Legend says he performed miracles healing the sick, comforting the dying. His tomb was lost when the cathedral was rebuilt in the 13th century. And now someone has found it," Father Brown mused, "and chosen to associate it with a missing nurse. The symbolic connection is rather pointed, wouldn't you say? A medieval bishop known for healing, and a modern woman dedicated to caring for the wounded." Colonel Zimmerman's pale eyes sharpened with interest. "You suspect deliberate symbolism rather than coincidence." "I suspect," Father Brown said gently, "that very little about this situation is coincidental. The question is whether we are looking at an elaborate shrine or an equally elaborate grave." The silence that followed his words seemed to press against them like the weight of the cathedral's stones. Father Brown studied each face, in turn the German officer's scholarly fascination warring with military practicality, the old sacristan's mystical dread, and the boy's carefully guarded knowledge. "There is another consideration," Colonel Zimmerman said finally. "Sister Marie-Claire's work involved treating wounded Allied soldiers who were attempting to evade capture. Her disappearance occurred at a time when we were actively investigating irregular activities in this district. The implications hung in the air like incense, heavy with unspoken accusations and dangers." Father Brown nodded slowly, understanding that the mystery before them involved not only the ancient dead and the recently missing, but the complex moral landscape of a city under occupation. As they prepared to leave the chancel, Father Brown noticed young Emil cast one last lingering look at the opened crypt. In that glance, he saw knowledge and fear and, perhaps something that might have been guilt. The boy knew more about Sister Marie-Claire's disappearance than he was prepared to reveal, and Father Brown suspected that, before this mystery was resolved, all of them would need to confront truths more complex than any medieval legend. Chapter 3. The Scholar's Obsession. The morning light had strengthened by the time Father Brown found himself seated in Colonel Zimmerman's temporary officer requisition room in the cathedral's ancient presbytery that had been transformed into something resembling a military headquarters crossed with a medieval scholar's study. Maps of Brussels shared wall space with carefully sketched architectural drawings, while volumes on ecclesiastical history sat beside official German correspondence. It was, Father Brown reflected, the sort of room that revealed a man at war, with himself as much as with any external enemy. "You must understand, Father," Colonel Zimmerman said, settling behind a desk that bore the scars of centuries, while pouring coffee from a military issue pot. "This discovery represents far more than a simple archaeological curiosity." His hands, Father Brown noticed, possessed the careful precision of a surgeon or a scholar, or perhaps both. "Indeed," Father Brown replied mildly, accepting the offered cup, "though I confess I find myself curious about your particular expertise. In such matters, military engineering rarely encompasses medieval church architecture." A smile flickered across the colonel's austere features, and for a moment, the weight of military bearing seemed to lift from his shoulders. "Before this war, I was professor of medieval studies at the University of Munich," he said. "My specialty was the ecclesiastical architecture of the Low Countries. St. Lutgardis has been a subject of my research for nearly a decade." Father Brown raised his eyebrows with genuine interest. "A remarkable coincidence, then, that you should find yourself stationed here." "Not entirely coincidental," Zimmerman admitted, his tone growing more careful. "When my unit was assigned to Brussels, I specifically requested oversight of this district, the opportunity to study these buildings firsthand." He paused, perhaps recognizing how his academic enthusiasm might sound to a man whose countrymen were fighting his army. "I realize this may seem strange to you, Father, but scholarship recognizes no national boundaries." "On the contrary," Father Brown said gently, "I find it rather encouraging, though I suspect your superiors might view your priorities with less understanding." The colonel's expression darkened slightly. "Military necessity takes precedence, naturally. But when military necessity and historical preservation can be reconciled," he gestured toward a series of detailed drawings spread across his desk. "These are my sketches of the crypt chamber. The stonework is extraordinarily clearly predating the main cathedral structure by at least 2 centuries. Father Brown leaned forward to examine the drawings, noting the meticulous attention to detail in every carved symbol and worn inscription. The man's scholarship was undeniably impressive, yet there was something almost fevered in the precision of his documentation. "The arrangement of the bones troubles me," Zimmerman continued, pointing to specific areas of his sketches. "They were positioned with deliberate care, not the casual disposal one might expect from a medieval burial, but something approaching ritual significance. The arms are crossed in the traditional Christian manner, yes, but notice the positioning of these smaller bones." Father Brown studied the indicated areas with growing interest. "The hands appear to be holding something." "Exactly," the colonel said, "though whatever they once held has long since decayed." But here he indicated another section of his drawing. "These markings on the stone beneath the skeleton, they're carved symbols, not natural wear patterns. The symbols, as rendered in Zimmerman's careful sketches, resembled a combination of Christian iconography and something older crosses intertwined with spirals. Latin letters mixed with marks that might have been runic, pre-Christian elements incorporated into Christian burial," Father Brown observed. "Not uncommon in the early medieval period, though the Church generally discouraged such syncretism." "Precisely," Zimmerman said, his scholarly excitement unmistakable. "Bishop Arnulf was known for his unconventional approaches to conversion. Historical records suggest he was more willing than his contemporaries to accommodate local traditions. Some of his methods were considered questionable by Rome." Father Brown sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "And Sister Marie, how does a missing Red Cross nurse fit into your historical researches?" The question seemed to bring the colonel back to present realities with uncomfortable force. "Sister Marie-Claire," he said slowly, "presents a more contemporary puzzle. Her work with wounded soldiers brought her to our attention several weeks ago." "She was treating German wounded as well as Allied?" Father Brown inquired. "No," Zimmerman replied quietly. "Her patients were exclusively Allied soldiers attempting to evade capture. She operated what we suspect was an organized network helping wounded men reach safe houses, providing medical care to those unable to reach official medical facilities. The implications hung in the air between them like smoke from a snuffed candle." Father Brown studied the colonel's face with his characteristic mild attention, noting the tension between duty and conscience that seemed to pull at the man's features. "Such activities would be considered treasonous under occupation law," Father Brown observed gently. Indeed, Zimmerman's voice had grown very quiet, though I confess I found myself reluctant to pursue the investigation with full vigor. Sister Marie-Claire's reputation for compassion was well established. She treated her patients without regard for nationality when circumstances permitted. But circumstances rarely permitted. Rarely. The colonel moved to the window overlooking the cathedral courtyard, where young Emile could be seen sweeping the steps with careful attention. The boy knows something about her disappearance. His behavior when we discovered the crypt was telling. Father Brown followed his gaze. Children often see things adults miss, though they don't always understand the significance of what they observe. Or they understand too well and choose silence over truth. Zimmerman turned back from the window, his expression troubled. The photograph placement was deliberate. Father, someone wanted us to find that image in that specific location. But was it meant as a memorial or as a message? And what sort of message might it convey? The colonel was quiet for a long moment, his scholarly mind clearly wrestling with possibilities both historical and contemporary. In medieval symbolism, the positioning of objects within sacred spaces carried specific meanings. A photograph placed upon the bones of a healing bishop might suggest, he paused, as if reluctant to voice his conclusion, might suggest that Sister Marie-Claire has joined Bishop Arnulf in his eternal rest. Father Brown completed gently, or, Zimmerman said, his voice barely above a whisper, that she has joined him in his work of healing the wounded, regardless of earthly consequences. Father Brown set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, studying the architectural drawings with new understanding. The colonel's scholarly obsession had led him to a conclusion that military duty would require him to act upon, yet his academic appreciation for medieval sanctuary traditions suggested complexities that pure duty could not address. The ancient stones seemed to press closer around them, as if the building itself were listening to their conversation. Outside, the sound of Emile's broom against the cathedral steps provided a rhythmic counterpoint to their discotuna, reminder that some acts of service continued regardless of the larger conflicts raging around them. Father Brown reflected that scholarship, like faith, could be both a blessing and a burden. Colonel Zimmerman's deep knowledge of medieval traditions had given him insights into the mystery that a simpler, military mind might have missed. But that same knowledge had also revealed moral complexities that made his position as an occupying officer considerably more difficult to bear. Chapter 4. Visions and Whispers. The afternoon sun slanted through the cathedral's damaged windows with the peculiar quality of light that seems to carry dust and centuries in equal measure. Father Brown found Per Matthias in the Lady Chapel, kneeling before a statue of the Virgin whose face bore the serene expression of one who has seen all human suffering and found it bearable. The old sacristan's lips moved in silent prayer, his weathered hands working the beads of a rosary worn smooth by decades of devotion. Father Brown waited respectfully until the prayers were finished, then approached with the careful deference one shows to age and holiness combined. Per Matthias looked up with eyes that seemed to hold reflections of candlelight, even in the daylight hours. "Ah, mon père," the old man said, rising stiffly from his knees. "I hoped you would come. There are things that must be spoken, though speaking them brings little comfort." "I am a good listener," Father Brown replied gently, settling himself on one of the wooden chairs that served penitents during confession. "And I find that uncomfortable truths often prove more valuable than comfortable lies." Per Matthias nodded slowly, his pale blue eyes focusing on something beyond the visible chapel. "You ask about Sister Marie-Claire," he said. "But to understand her fate, one must first understand this place, this cathedral that has sheltered souls for 9 centuries. Colonel Zimmerman tells me you know its history better than anyone living." "History," the old man repeated, as if tasting the word for hidden meanings. "Motor, I know the history written in books, but I know also the history written in stone and shadow, in the whispers that echo from the vaults long after the whisperers have gone to their rest." Father Brown leaned forward slightly, recognizing the tone of a man preparing to share experiences that rational minds might dismiss but faithful hearts might understand. "What do the stones tell you, Per Matthias?" The sacristan's gaze drifted toward the main altar, where the afternoon light created patterns of brightness and darkness that seemed to shift with each passing cloud. "The cathedral has always been a place of sanctuary," he said. "Not merely the official sanctuary granted by canon law, but something older, deeper. The ground itself seems to call to those who suffer." "You speak as one who has witnessed such calls personally. For 40 years I have tended this place," Per Matthias replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 40 years of dawn masses and vespers, of polishing brass and trimming wicks. One learns to hear what the cathedral wishes to say. Father Brown nodded encouragingly, noting how the old man's hands had begun to tremble, not with age alone, but with the effort of giving voice to experiences that lived more naturally in silence. In the early years, it was simple things, the sacristan continued, footsteps in empty chapels, the sound of weeping from the confessionals where no penitents were present. I told myself it was the wind, the settling of old stones, but gradually, he paused, crossing himself with automatic devotion. Gradually, I began to see what, precisely? Matthias turned to face Father Brown directly, his watery eyes suddenly sharp with memory. Processions, mon père. Medieval processions, moving through these aisles, at the hour between midnight and dawn. Monks, in robes so white they seemed to carry their own light, carrying banners I could never quite read, chanting in Latin so pure it made my poor pronunciation seem like blasphemy. Father Brown absorbed this revelation with characteristic calm. Did these visions disturb you at first? Yes, I thought perhaps I was losing my reason, or that God was calling me to some special service I did not understand. But the visions brought peace, not terror. The white-robed figures never threatened. They seemed instead to be tending to invisible wounded, offering comfort to sufferers I could not see. And the old man's expression grew troubled, and he glanced toward the chancel where the bishop's throne sat askew above its violated crypt. 3 weeks ago, the visions became more urgent. The white-robed figures moved with greater purpose, and among them, I began to see a woman, Sister Marie-Claire. I cannot be certain, Père Matthias said carefully. The figure wore white like the others, but her face was that of a living woman, not the serene countenances of the blessed dead. She moved among the medieval monks as if she belonged with them, tending to the same invisible wounded with the same endless compassion. Father Brown pondered this description, noting how the old sacristan's mystical experiences seemed to parallel Colonel Zimmerman's scholarly insights about the cathedral's history of sanctuary. Did this woman figure speak to you? Not in words, Père Matthias replied, but her eyes, mon père. Her eyes spoke of desperate need. She looked at me as if pleading for something I could not understand, and always she gestured toward the area where we later found the disturbed crypt. You never thought to investigate the area she indicated? Père Matthias shook his head firmly. One does not intrude upon the mysteries of the saints. Father, if the blessed dead wished to reveal something, they would do so in their own time and manner. Father Brown considered this response, recognizing the delicate balance between faith and superstition that marked genuine religious experience. And when the crypt was discovered, did your visions cease? No, the old man said, his voice growing even quieter. They have intensified. Now I see the woman figure standing directly above the opened grave, her hands extended as if in blessing or benediction. But her face, he shuddered slightly. Her face shows neither the peace of the dead nor the simple worry of the living, but something between, as if she exists in that terrible space between one state and the other. The chapel fell silent, except for the distant sound of wind through the damaged tower. Father Brown studied the old sacristan's face, seeing there the marks of a man who had lived too long in proximity to mysteries beyond ordinary comprehension. Père Matthias, he said gently, do you believe Sister Marie-Claire is dead? The old man was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the statue of the Virgin. I believe, he said finally, that she has joined the eternal procession of those who serve the wounded and the suffering. Whether that service continues in this world or the next. He spread his hands in a gesture of uncertainty. The visions do not make such distinctions clear. Father Brown nodded slowly, understanding that he had heard testimony to something that transcended simple categories of truth and falsehood. The old sacristan's mystical experiences, whether born of supernatural insight or the profound sympathy of a lifetime spent in service, had revealed connections between past and present that mere investigation might never uncover. As they sat in the peaceful dimness of the Lady Chapel, Father Brown reflected that the greatest mysteries often lay, not in what could be seen and measured, but in the spaces between seeing and believing, between what was and what might yet come to pass. Père Matthias had spent 40 years learning to listen to such spaces, and his testimony suggested that Sister Marie-Claire's fate was woven into patterns far older and more complex than a simple wartime disappearance. Chapter 5. The Boy Who saw angels. Father Brown had always maintained that children possessed a peculiar gift for seeing truth unadorned by the elaborate deceptions that adults constructed around inconvenient realities. It was with this conviction in mind that he sought out young Emil in the cathedral's small bell tower, where the boy had retreated after completing his evening duties. The tower, damaged though it was, still offered a view of Brussels that encompassed both the graceful spires of undamaged churches and the harsh geometric lines of military encampments. Emil sat on a wooden crate that had once held candles, his thin legs dangling over the edge as he gazed out through a gap torn in the ancient stones by German artillery. His dark hair caught the last rays of autumn sunlight, and his profile showed the sharp angles that hunger carved into young faces during wartime. Yet his eyes, when he turned to acknowledge Father Brown's approach, held a depth that suggested experiences far beyond his 12 years. "Bonjour, Emile," Father Brown said quietly, settling himself on another crate with the careful movements of a man mindful of both his dignity and the precarious nature of war-damaged masonry. "Bonjour, mon père," the boy replied, though his gaze quickly returned to the window. "I come here to think. The colonel says thinking too much makes boys melancholy, but Père Matthias says thinking is how we understand God's will." "Both observations contain wisdom," Father Brown replied mildly, "though I suspect your current thoughts concern more earthly matters than divine will." Emil's hands, Father Brown noticed, were clenched tightly in his lapknot with the casual nervousness of childhood, but with the deliberate tension of someone guarding a secret too large for young shoulders to bear easily. "The colonel asked me about Sister Marekla again today," Emil said finally. "He speaks very gently, but his eyes are not gentle. They are the eyes of a man who must find answers, even when the answers will cause pain. And do you have answers that might cause pain?" The boy was quiet for a long moment, studying the cityscape below as if it might offer guidance. "Sister Marie Claire was kind to me," he said eventually. "When the other children called me a reindeer and threw stones, she would bandage my cuts and give me bread. She never asked questions about where I slept or why I had no family. She simply saw hunger and fed it." Father Brown nodded, recognizing the particular loyalty that acts of simple kindness could inspire in children who had learned to expect little from the adult world. Such kindness creates bonds that transcend ordinary obligations. "Yes," Emil said, his voice growing stronger. "That is why I must be careful with my words. The colonel is not evil. Have seen evil men, and he is not one of them. But he serves a cause that would punish Sister Marekle's kindness as treason." The precision of this observation struck Father Brown as remarkable. The boy had grasped moral complexities that often escaped adult minds entirely. "You spoke of seeing angels bury bones," Father Brown said gently. "Would you tell me more about this vision?" Emil turned to face him directly, and Father Brown saw fear war with trust in the child's expression. "It was not angels, as Père Matthias describes them in his stories," he said carefully. "These were angels who wore the white robes of healing, not the golden vestments of heaven. Human angels." Then, perhaps the boy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It was very late, the hour when even the German sentries grow drowsy at their posts. I could not sleep because my stomach was empty, so I came to the cathedral to pray for patience with hunger. That is when I saw the white figures moving in the chancel." Father Brown waited patiently, recognizing that rushed questioning would likely frighten the boy into silence. "There were 3 of them," Emil continued. 2 carried what looked like bundles wrapped in white cloth, bundles the size of ... He paused as if reluctant to complete the thought. "The size of a person." Emil nodded reluctantly. The 3rd figure directed them where to place their burden. This one moved with authority like Sister Marie Claire when she tended the wounded. Quick, certain movements that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done. "And the burial itself, what did you observe?" The boy's hands clenched tighter. "They did not bury the bundles, mon père. They placed them carefully in the crypt beneath the bishop's throne, the same crypt we discovered 3 days ago. But they arranged the old bones around the bundles as if he'd struggled for words, as if creating a shrine. Yes, as if they were making a holy place, not a grave. The bones were positioned like guardians, like the stone saints who watch over the cathedral doors." And then Emil's voice grew even quieter. "Then the one who directed the others took something from beneath her robes and placed it among the bones." Father Brown's pulse quickened slightly, though he maintained his calm exterior. "Her robes, you could tell this figure was a woman." The way she moved, Emile said simply. Women moved differently than men, even when they try to hide it. And when she leaned over the crypt, I saw her face in the candlelight. It was Sister Marie Claire. The revelation hung in the air between them like the sound of a bell struck once, and allowed to fade into silence. Father Brown studied the boy's face, seeing there the burden of knowledge that was both precious and dangerous. And after the ceremony, what became of Sister Marie Claire and her companions? Emile shook his head. They disappeared into the shadows of the cathedral. I waited until dawn, but I never saw them leave. It was as if the stones themselves had swallowed them. Father Brown pondered this account, recognizing in it elements that supported both Per Matthias's mystical interpretation and Colonel Zimmerman's practical concerns. The boy had witnessed something that was simultaneously supernatural and entirely human, a ritual that honored ancient traditions while serving contemporary necessities. Emile, he said gently, do you believe Sister Marie Claire is alive? The boy turned back to the window where the last light of day was fading into the blue darkness of wartime Brussels. I believe, he said slowly, that she has found a way to continue her work of healing, even when the world believes her work is finished. Father Brown nodded slowly, understanding that he had received perhaps the most crucial piece of testimony in the entire mystery. The boy had seen not a burial but a transformation, not an ending but a carefully orchestrated beginning of something that transcended the usual boundaries between life and death, between service that could be seen and service that must remain hidden. As they sat in the gathering darkness of the damaged tower, Father Brown reflected that truth often revealed itself most clearly to those who had learned to see with eyes unclouded by adult assumptions about what was possible and what was not. Young Emile had witnessed a miracle of the most practical sort, the kind that preserved life by appearing to celebrate death, and continued healing by embracing the appearance of loss. Chapter 6. The missing nurse. The next morning found Father Brown in the narrow streets that surrounded the cathedral streets, where the medieval stones seemed to whisper of secrets as old as the first Christian martyrs and as fresh as yesterday's acts of clandestine mercy. He had risen early, driven by the peculiar restlessness that overtakes a detective when scattered pieces of truth begin to form a pattern, one that promises to be both more beautiful and more dangerous than initially suspected. His first visit was to Madame Françoise Delacroix, a widow whose modest house on the Rue des Martyrs bore the subtle signs of genteel poverty, made more acute by wartime deprivations. She received him in a parlor where faded photographs of her late husband, a doctor who had died in the early months of the war, shared space with medical texts that suggested the household's continuing connection to the healing arts. Sister Marie Claire, Madame Delacroix repeated, her weathered hands folding carefully in her lap. Ah, mon père, that name brings both comfort and pain to this house. She was known to you personally? Father Brown inquired gently, settling into a chair that had seen better decades but still maintained its dignity. Known to us. She saved my grandson's life, the elderly woman replied, her voice carrying the particular intensity of gratitude, mixed with grief. Paul, my daughter's boy, was wounded when the Germans first entered the city. A piece of shrapnel in his shoulder, nothing that would ordinarily prove fatal, but the official hospitals, she gestured helplessly, the official hospitals were reserved for German wounded. Father Brown completed with understanding. Precisely. For 3 days, Paul burned with fever while we watched him grow weaker. The neighborhood doctor had been conscripted, and we had no morphine, no proper bandages, no knowledge of how to extract metal from flesh without causing greater harm. Madame Delacroix paused, crossing herself with automatic devotion. Then Sister Marie Claire appeared at our door like an answer to prayer. Father Brown leaned forward with interest. How did she know of your grandson's condition? That was the remarkable thing, the widow replied. She said she had heard of our need from a friend who watches over the suffering. I never learned who this friend might be, but Sister Marie Claire seemed to know exactly where help was most desperately required, and her treatment of your grandson. Madame Delacroix's eyes brightened with the memory. She worked through the night, extracting the shrapnel with instruments that seemed to appear from nowhere. Her skill was extraordinary. Paul later said, she moved like a surgeon who had performed such operations hundreds of times, but more than her skill it was her manner. The old woman paused, searching for adequate words. Her manner. She spoke to Paul throughout the operation or medical instructions, but words of comfort. She told him stories of Saint Lutgardus, how the blessed saint had healed the wounded during her earthly life. She made Paul believe that his healing was part of some greater pattern of mercy that stretched back through centuries. Father Brown nodded thoughtfully. And afterward, did Sister Marie-Claire continue to visit? She returned twice to check Paul's progress, Madame Delacroix said. But by then, we understood that we were not her only concern. She spoke of other wounded souls who required her attention, not just physical wounds, but the spiritual injuries that war inflicts upon the innocent. Other wounded souls. The widow lowered her voice conspiratorially. Allied soldiers, men who had escaped German capture but were too injured to reach safety without assistance. Sister Marie-Claire operated what we came to understand was an entire network of mercy. Father Brown absorbed this information with characteristic calm, though his mind was rapidly connecting patterns that had previously seemed unrelated. This network did it operate from the cathedral? Partly, Madame Delacroix confirmed. Sister Marie-Claire spoke of the cathedral as a place where wounded souls could find sanctuary, just as they had in medieval times. She said the stones themselves remembered their duty to shelter the helpless. A romantic notion, Father Brown observed mildly, perhaps, but effective. Through her network, dozens of wounded men found safe passage to friendly territory. She used her medical credentials to move freely through the city, her religious habits to gain access to places others could not reach, and her knowledge of the cathedral's hidden spaces to provide temporary shelter. Father Brown considered the implications of this revelation. Such activities would have required considerable resources, medical supplies, food, contacts with resistance networks. Indeed, Sister Marie-Claire once mentioned that her work was supported by those who understood that healing transcends political boundaries. Madame Delacroix's expression grew troubled, but in recent weeks, her visits became more hurried, more anxious. She spoke of growing German suspicion, of investigations that were drawing closer to the truth. She feared discovery. She feared for others more than herself. The widow nodded. Her greatest concern was that her capture might compromise the safety of those who had helped her, families like ours who had sheltered wounded soldiers, clergy who had provided sanctuary, merchants who had supplied medical necessities. Father Brown rose from his chair with sudden understanding. She spoke of these fears in her final visits. Her last visit was 3 weeks ago, Madame Delacroix said sadly. She came to check on Paul one final time, but also to warn us. She said that if anything should happen to her, we must remember that sometimes the greatest mercy appears in the guise of the greatest tragedy. Curious phrasing, Father Brown observed. I thought so at the time, but she insisted that we must not mourn overmuch if we heard news of her death, because death itself might prove to be merely another form of service. The old woman shook her head slowly. I confess I did not understand her meaning then. I understand it a little better now. Father Brown moved to the window overlooking the street where ordinary citizens pursued their daily struggles. Against the backdrop of military occupation, the pattern was becoming clearer with each revelation. Sister Marie-Claire had not simply disappeared, but had deliberately orchestrated her apparent demise to protect her network while continuing her work under deeper cover. Madame Delacroix, he said gently, if Sister Marie-Claire were to contact you today, would you assist her despite the official reports of her death? The widow's answer came without hesitation, without question. Mon père, death or no death, official reports or no reports, that woman earned the loyalty of every soul she touched. If she has found a way to continue her work from beyond the grave, then perhaps the saints have truly returned to walk among us. Father Brown nodded slowly, understanding that he had uncovered not merely a network of resistance, but something approaching a religious movement. That viewed Sister Marie-Claire's humanitarian work as a continuation of medieval traditions, of sanctuary and healing. The photograph in the crypt was not a memorial to the dead, but a declaration that such work continued, regardless of earthly circumstances. As he prepared to leave, Father Brown reflected that the most effective deceptions were often those that told a deeper truth than the surface facts they concealed. Sister Marie-Claire's apparent death had become the means by which her actual life could continue, serving purposes larger than individual survival. The mystery was solving itself, but the solution raised questions about the nature of service, sacrifice, and the thin line between earthly duty and heavenly calling. Chapter 7. Sanctuary and Betrayal. The evening rain fell upon Brussels with the persistence of tears shed for ancient sorrows, turning the cobblestones around St. Lutgardus into mirrors that reflected both gaslight and the deeper shadows of human conscience. Father Brown stood in the cathedral presbytery, watching as Colonel Zimmerman paced before the window with the measured gait of a man wrestling with obligations that pulled his soul in opposite directions. "The investigation cannot continue indefinitely," Zimmerman said, his voice carrying the weight of military necessity tempered by scholarly reluctance. "My superiors grow impatient with what they perceive as unnecessary delay in resolving a simple matter of a missing person. Simple matters," Father Brown observed mildly, "have a curious tendency to become complex when examined closely. Rather, like medieval manuscripts, the more carefully one studies them, the more layers of meaning reveal themselves." The colonel turned from the window, his pale eyes reflecting something between appreciation and exasperation. "Your investigation has been thorough, Father, perhaps too thorough for military preferences. What conclusions have you reached?" Father Brown settled himself in a chair that had likely served generations of clerics facing difficult decisions. "I have reached several conclusions, though I confess they raise as many questions as they answer. Would you care to hear them?" "Please." "First," Father Brown began, counting off points on his fingers with characteristic precision, "Sister Maria's disappearance was not the result of capture, accident, or conventional death. Second, the arrangement of artifacts in the crypt was deliberate and symbolic, intended to convey a specific message to those capable of interpreting it. Third, young Emil witnessed not a burial but a ceremony of concealment. Fourth, Permith visions, however one chooses to interpret their supernatural content, accurately describe activities that have been occurring within the cathedral's hidden spaces." Colonel Zimmerman had grown very still during this recitation. "And your fifth conclusion, that you, Colonel, have known far more about Sister Marie Claire's fate than your official position has permitted you to acknowledge." The silence that followed this statement seemed to press against the presbytery's ancient walls like accumulated centuries of unspoken confessions. Zimmerman moved to his desk, where his medieval architectural drawings lay scattered among military reports and correspondence. "Knowledge," he said finally, "can be both a blessing and a burden for a soldier. Father, particularly knowledge that conflicts with duty. Indeed, though I suspect your conflict runs deeper than simple military obligations." Father Brown paused, studying the colonel's face with gentle attention. "Your research into St. Lutgardis's history provided you with unique insight into the cathedral's traditional role as sanctuary. When Sister Marie Claire's activities came to your attention, you found yourself facing a choice between enforcing occupation law and respecting ecclesiastical tradition." Zimmerman's hand moved unconsciously toward one of his architectural detailed drawing of the cathedral's underground passages. "As Sister Marie Claire's network was remarkably sophisticated," he admitted quietly. "Her use of the cathedral's medieval sanctuary spaces showed both desperation and remarkable historical knowledge she could have acquired only with assistance from someone well versed in the building's architecture." "Yes." The words seemed to cost the colonel considerable effort. "Our initial investigation revealed that she had been using the ancient crypt passages to shelter wounded Allied soldiers. The network extended through several buildings connected by underground tunnels dating to the 13th century. Father Brown nodded slowly. "And when the investigation grew too close to discovery, Sister Marie Claire requested a meeting." Zimmerman continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "She proposed a solution that would satisfy military requirements while preserving the sanctuary traditions that had protected the innocent for centuries. She proposed to stage her own death. More precisely, she proposed to disappear in such a manner that official records could declare her deceased, while the reality remained ambiguous." The colonel moved to the window again, watching the rain create patterns on the glass that resembled tears. The photograph in the crypt was her idea message to those who needed to know that her work continued, while providing official investigators with evidence of her demise. Father Brown absorbed this revelation with characteristic calm, though his mind was rapidly connecting the final elements of the puzzle. "And you assisted in this deception." "I provided the architectural knowledge necessary to create a convincing crime scene," Zimmerman admitted. "My understanding of medieval burial practices ensured that the arrangement would appear authentic to cursory investigation while conveying deeper meaning to those initiated into the cathedral's true purpose. A scholarly contribution to an ancient tradition of sanctuary, perhaps, or perhaps simply the decision of a man who found himself unable to prosecute compassion as if it were a crime." The colonel's reflection in the rain-streaked window showed a face marked by the particular exhaustion that comes from serving causes that war with conscience. "The current arrangement serves multiple purposes," he observed. "Official records show Sister Marie-Claire is deceased, satisfying military requirements. The resistance network believes she has been martyred, inspiring continued service. And the reality, Zimmerman completed, is that she continues her work from within the cathedral's hidden spaces, tending to wounded souls who officially do not exist, supported by a community that officially believes her dead. An elegant solution to an impossible situation. Elegant perhaps, but temporary." The colonel turned back to face Father Brown directly. "My superiors have ordered a complete structural survey of the cathedral. German engineers will examine every stone, every passage, every hidden space. Any ongoing sanctuary activities will be discovered within days." The weight of this revelation settled over the presbytery, like the accumulation of centuries. Father Brown understood that the ancient game of sanctuary and pursuit, which had protected the innocent since medieval times, was approaching its modern conclusion. The very thoroughness that made Sister Marie-Claire's deception effective would soon make it impossible to maintain. "How long do we have?" Father Brown asked quietly. 2 days, Zimmerman replied. "Perhaps 3 if the weather delays. The engineering teens." Father Brown rose from his chair with sudden decision, understanding that the mystery he had been called to solve was transforming into a moral crisis that demanded action rather than mere understanding. The ancient walls of St. Lutgardis had sheltered the suffering for 9 centuries, but they were about to face their greatest test, whether the traditions of sanctuary could survive the methodical scrutiny of modern warfare. As he prepared to leave the presbytery, Father Brown reflected that some mysteries could only be resolved through choice rather than deduction. The question was no longer what had happened to Sister Marie-Claire, but what would happen to the continuing tradition of mercy that her apparent sacrifice had been designed to preserve. Chapter 8. The truth in stone and spirit. Dawn broke over Brussels with the pale reluctance of a penitent approaching confession, and Father Brown found himself standing once again before the opened crypt beneath the bishop's throne. But this time, he was not alone in seeking truth among the ancient bones. Beside him stood Colonel Zimmerman, Per Matthias, and young Imlich, representing a different strand of the mystery that had woven itself around Sister Marie-Claire's disappearance. What they were about to witness would challenge every assumption they had made about the nature of death, service, and the eternal struggle between law and mercy. "The German engineers arrive at noon," Zimmerman said quietly, his scholarly excitement now tempered by genuine concern for consequences beyond his control. "Whatever resolution we attempt must be completed by then." Father Brown nodded, though his attention was focused on a subtle sound echoing from the cathedral's depths, a rhythm so faint it might have been mistaken for the settling of ancient stones, but which his experienced ear recognized as something far more significant. "Per Matthias," he said gently, "your vision spoke of white-robed figures tending to invisible wounded. I believe the time has come to make the invisible visible." The old sacristan's eyes widened with understanding, mixed with trepidation. "You wish to disturb the sanctuary of the blessed dead?" "On the contrary," Father Brown replied with a slight smile. "I wish to reveal the sanctuary of the blessed living." Before anyone could question this cryptic statement, Father Brown approached the crypt opening and spoke in a voice that carried clearly into the underground passages. "Sister Marie-Claire, I believe it is time for resurrection." The silence that followed seemed to stretch through Trizento. Gradually, a new sound emerged from the depths, the soft whisper of robes against stone, accompanied by the careful footsteps of someone moving through familiar darkness. A figure in white appeared at the edge of the crypt opening, and Sister Marie-Claire Dubois climbed gracefully into the chancel of St. Lutgardis Cathedral. She was alive, mistakably and radiantly alive, though her appearance bore the marks of weeks spent in underground spaces. Her Red Cross uniform had been replaced by simple white robes that made her seem like a figure from Per Matthias's visions, and her face showed the particular serenity that comes to those who have found their true calling, despite impossible circumstances. "Bonjour, mon père," she said to Father Brown with calm dignity. "I confess I have been expecting this conversation." "As have I," Father Brown replied gently, "though I admit the precise timing remained uncertain until Colonel Zimmerman explained the urgency of our situation." Emile stepped forward with the impulsive loyalty of childhood. positioning himself protectively beside Sister Marie. "She saved my life," he said fiercely, "and the lives of many others. If the Germans want to arrest her, they must arrest me as well." Sister Marie-Claire placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Emile, mon brave, your protection has been invaluable, but this moment requires different kinds of courage." "Indeed," Father Brown agreed. "The courage to trust that truth, however complex, serves justice better than comfortable deceptions." Colonel Zimmerman had remained silent during this exchange, but now he stepped forward with the bearing of a man who had reached a decision that would define his character, regardless of its consequences. "Sister Marie-Claire," he said formally, "according to official German records, you died 3 weeks ago. A death certificate has been filed, and military investigation concluded. As far as my superiors are concerned, this case is closed. And yet here I stand," she replied with gentle irony. "Here you stand," Zimmerman confirmed, "but not as Sister Marie-Claire Dubois, Red Cross nurse and suspected enemy collaborator. That woman died officially and completely. The woman before us is someone else entirely, perhaps a lay sister attached to this cathedral, perhaps a volunteer who assists Per Matthias with his sacred duties." Father Brown watched this exchange with growing admiration for the colonel's capacity to find solutions that honored both duty and conscience. "A bureaucratic resurrection," he observed. "The dead remain dead in official records, while the living find new ways to serve." "Precisely," Zimmerman said. "My architectural survey will conclude that the cathedral's underground passages are structurally sound but historically insignificant medieval storage areas of no contemporary relevance. Any wounded soldiers currently sheltering in those spaces will regrettably be classified as German deserters seeking sanctuary rather than Allied escapees requiring capture." Sister Marie-Claire's eyes reflected understanding of the elegant complexity of this solution. "And my work, your work," Per Matthias interjected with sudden clarity, "becomes part of the cathedral's traditional ministry to the suffering, as it always was, as it always should be." Father Brown nodded slowly, recognizing in this resolution the same pattern that had protected sanctuary seekers for centuries, not through direct defiance of authority, but through the creative interpretation of law that allowed mercy to flourish within the boundaries of official compliance. "There remains one practical matter," he said. "The photograph in the crypta, evidence of your death, must be preserved to maintain the official fiction." "The photograph remains," Sister Marie-Claire agreed, "along with the bones of Bishop Arnulf, who understood that healing the wounded transcends political boundaries. Let it stand as testimony that some traditions are too sacred to dive in when their practitioners must occasionally appear to do so." Colonel Zimmerman gathered his architectural drawings with brisk efficiency. "My report will be filed this afternoon," he said. "It will conclude that while Sister Marie-Claire Dubois tragically perished during the investigation, the cathedral itself poses no security concerns and may continue its normal religious functions without further military oversight." Young Emile looked up at Sister Marie-Claire with the bright understanding of childhood grasping adult complexities. "You will still care for the wounded soldiers?" "I will care for all who suffer," she replied simply. "German, Allied, or civilian. Pain recognizes no nationality, and mercy acknowledges no borders." As the group prepared to separate, returning to roles that were both the same and transformed by their shared understanding, Father Brown reflected on the peculiar nature of mysteries that solved themselves through revelation rather than detection. The truth about Sister Marie-Claire had not required investigation so much as recognition, the recognition that some forms of service were too important to be interrupted by death, whether real or carefully staged. The Cathedral of St. Luc settled back into its ancient rhythm of prayer and sanctuary, its damaged stones bearing witness to another chapter in the eternal story of those who choose mercy over law, service over safety, and love over the countless lesser loyalties that divide human hearts. In the crypt beneath the bishop's throne, medieval bones and a modern photograph continued their silent testimony to the truth that healing and hope could survive any war, outlast any occupation, and transform any apparent ending into a new beginning. Mystery was solved, but the greater mystery, how ordinary people found the courage to become saints in the most unlikely circumstances, remained as profound and inspiring as ever. Thanks for joining us for The Bones of the Bishop. Did you suspect that Sister Marie-Claire had staged her own death before Father Brown revealed the truth about the sanctuary network? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this wartime adventure with Father Brown, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember Father Brown's wisdom. The greatest mysteries often lie not in what appears to be lost, but in what chooses to remain hidden until the moment is right for revelation. Sometimes, the most profound truth is that apparent endings can become the most meaningful beginnings. This is Alie, signing off from Café Tales.